And it's going to be Jon Buford. Jon has been sort of like on the forefront of the startup community in Hong Kong, starting Startups HK in, was it 2009? So working on sort of like one of the first co-working spaces in Hong Kong, a small place in Wan Chai, years ago. Well, that's what it feels like. Explored sort of like as one of the successful cases in an early stage how to use crowdfunding. Was one of the earlier companies exploring the space of 3D printing. And since that's been going on for a while, I think he's got lots of stories to share on that one. So be ready for the next good sharing session by welcoming Jon Buford.
Good morning. All right, just to give you a little bit of background of kind of what I've been doing over the last, 14 years that I've been out of university or whatever. So I started out in toys. So that's how I first came to Hong Kong back in 2000. So I was working for a company in LA, and then I would come over here and do manufacturing and everything in the local office. I moved on to consumer products. Back in 2005, I did a crowdfunded product that, if you pull me aside later, I'll get into the details. But needless to say, it's in a category that's still not really crowdfundable, and it was before Kickstarter was even imagined. Got into invention licensing and actually had a pretty stable invention licensing business up until 2008, where the retail market collapsed. And that kind of spun out, all the invention licensing kind of became unstable at that point, which from then I said, okay, let's get back into software, because that's how I paid for my pizza and beer in college. So I got back into online software, did a project management system, and I'll mention some of the interactions with that during my presentation. And then that went down in a nice ball of flame about 2010. My rebound startup for that was Boot HK, which was the first co-work space here in Hong Kong. So it's we basically set up Boot HK as, it was kind of a community thing, but then also potentially it could have been a business, but I decided to go off and do Makeable instead at that point. And then for the last 3 years, I've been building Makeable, which is, potentially some people know a lot about it, some people may be clueless about, but I'll walk you through the background story, and then we'll get into lessons learned. So, back in 2011, we decided to do a platform called Makeable, so this was when Kickstarter was just starting to get some traction. Indiegogo was the kind of the unsuccessful cousin of it. And we said, you know what, we think there's a space in the market to be able to do a platform that connects up the people that are actually building these things to collaborate in the background and then fund it, and then provide that resource for actually getting it into the market. So we would own the supply chain part of it, and then we would have on the site a way to collaborate before you crowdfund it. And so that was kind of our take on the crowdfunding thing. Now, in order to get that up and running, we seeded it with projects that we internally built or that we collaborated on with somebody locally. And the most successful one was called the Makey Box. Makeable, Makey Box, I know, really original branding. But it validated the fact that we actually had a potential to build a platform, but then at the same time, so we raised over $100,000 on our platform for that particular project. But then that gave us enough information to understand that actually we're probably better off focusing on the hardware side and let other people do the crowdfunding platforms. So that was a big pivot for the company. And that actually led to, basically at that point, there was a mismatch between the original founders, and that led to some stuff I'll talk about later. So for about 2 years since then, we've been filling the obligations for getting the Makey box out the door. And that was definitely where everything went pear-shaped. Because we pivoted focusing from crowdfunding to this one product, but it was intended to be just kind of a bootstrappy product, but then it became the company. And so everything kind of started out on the wrong foot, I would say, and then it kind of led to disaster in the end. So, kind of getting into like general lessons learned, and how does this relate to dating, marriage, all these things. Well, so one thing that I definitely learned from all of my past experiences was, one, when you actually hook up with a co-founder, or even an early employee, whatever it is, you think of it as just like if you're getting a job, right? Early on, you're like, oh, it's just a company, you come together, yeah, you spend some time with these folks, but at the same time, it's just a job. But the reality is, you spend more time with these same people under worse conditions than you would ever with a partner that you would marry or whatever, have a long-term relationship. So, which is actually more important for you to stop and really consider? Like you're putting yourself into a situation with an investor, with a co-founder, that the likelihood is that the situation at some point is going to be really bad. And a lot of people don't really think about this going into it. The other thing is finding compliments. So it's great if you and this other guy can sit down and just geek out about how great this software is going to be. But if you don't have the other people that can push back and say, you know what, guys, that's great, but we really need to ship. Or that's great, but how are we going to make money? It's very easy for you to fall in love with somebody that you get along with inherently because you both just go like, oh, I get it, right? But it's much more difficult to find somebody that's compatible with you while having a complementary, contrasting skill set. And that's the hard part about finding investors and co-founders. It's not something that should be taken lightly, but then it's also something that it's the difference between dating and marriage. Would you date her? Yeah. Would you marry her? Well, not really. So that's kind of a lot of, I think, what a lot of people don't realize until years later, when everything has gone pear-shaped, or when somebody leaves and it's that awkward, you run into them in a social situation, you're like, so how are things going? And So that's probably the first and the big thing that a lot of people don't really think through. Communication. Well, actually, let me go back to this one. So specifically for me, one of the startups that I did is the first online software startup. My co-founder and I, we started it, we met on the Dragon Boat team for Llama, which is that island over there. So he was a web guy, I was kind of a general product guy, and we were kind of like, okay, we think project management is going to be the next big thing. Like this is before Asana or any of these guys were on the market. And we said, okay, we're gonna create this together. Started working together, we split the company 50-50, which is, if there's one thing that anybody should leave with, never do 50-50, at least 51-49, right? But then also, one thing that we didn't do up front was having some sort of vesting as part of that. So even if it was 50-50, but then you do vesting, so if somebody doesn't contribute in the way that you're expecting, you at least have some way written in to recover, right? I think the other thing that was a mismatch was, and the oil and water, I think it's expectations within your life. And different people will have different ways of approaching things, which may not really seem so important up at the beginning, but 6 months down the road, a year down the road, when you feel like the other person's slacking off, but maybe they feel like you're being pretty much just an asshole because you're too much. You have to find that right mix, and you have to, if it's not working, you have to sit down and actually say, okay, what is acceptable, and why are we having a problem here? It's, again, goes back to a successful marriage, right? If you can't sit down and talk through things, eventually it's going to blow up, and it's going to be over something that doesn't really matter, and the core issue is never going to come up because you never were able to talk about it, which gets into communication. Communication is really the core of everything, right? You have to talk to investors, you have to talk to employees, you have to talk to customers. If you can't communicate, and there's so many different ways that you communicate, everything just eventually breaks down. And usually it breaks down to the point that it's fatal to something. If it's fatal to a deal, if it's fatal to moving to the next step. For me, the biggest issue that I've had recently with Makeable, so Makeable, we built it up, and then we ran into cash flow issues. It's a hardware company. It's very easy for you to get into where all of a sudden you're 100,000, 300,000 in the hole just because timing of money coming in and money going out just didn't work out. And the thing is, what happened in that situation was because we had cash flow issues for inventory, for being able to pay to ship things out, right? So even if you have finished goods, if you can't pay to ship them halfway around the world, then you can't fill your obligations, and you have to go back to other guys and say, look, if we can get through this, then everything's going to be golden. But one of the problems that I didn't realize was a problem until too late was understanding what people are expecting in terms of investors, what are they expecting in terms of communication, and living up to those obligations. And so up front, we didn't really clearly establish what were the expectations. I would say that I didn't have mentors that would push me into what would be acceptable in that sense. So I didn't really have that feedback loop that would have kind of said, oh, hey, by the way, you really should be doing this. And because if you don't, a year from now, when something happens, then you're not really going to be able to easily recover from it because you're going to have to go back through and catch people up. And depending on the situation, you may not be able to really move beyond that because people may feel like their trust was betrayed maybe, if you weren't adequately communicating on things. And I think that was the one big problem that prevented. So right now, Makeable is kind of in a certain situation that I can't really go too deeply into about where it's going or anything like that, but I can talk about how we got there, right? And where we're at right now with it, it's in a stalemate. And a lot of that was probably caused by the fact that I didn't properly communicate about what was happening with the business over time to investors. So once we got into a bad situation, saying, hey guys, we need to do this. And they're like, well, what's the current situation? I'm like, well, it's this bad. And they're like, how did we get there? It's like, well, we paid people money and we sent stuff out. And we have this much discrepancy. And they're like, well, how can we trust you at this point because you haven't really been keeping up with this. You haven't been forthcoming with this information. And so that's one big issue that I definitely learned from the current situation, is establishing what is expected and keeping up with that, but then also finding the right people to push you to understand what potentially could go wrong, and say, you really should be doing this. On the other hand, and this gets into a later point, which is kind of finding focus, but I put myself in this situation where I was the public facade for the company, but I was also the key operations guy, but also the person actually creating product. So I was kind of like in a cross role where I really had too much going on. And in hindsight, I really should have brought in either an operations guy or somebody that would lead the engineering side of things, whatever it is, like something to split up the roles once we hit a critical point. And I think with a lot of companies, it's hard to tell exactly where that point is, because it's the traditional, like, you throw a live lobster into a pot and you turn on the water to boil. You don't really realize how deep you're into it until you hit a critical point that makes you go back and look at, really how much were you doing? How effective were you at that point? Back in December, so about the same time as Martin, that was when we started really seeing the writing on the wall in terms of, we saw that we needed to raise funds in order to continue smooth operations. But at the same time, we were getting production up and running. Okay, we're getting production up and running internally within our Hong Kong facility. So we were actually building up a small manufacturing, like a group of people running the manufacturing, getting all the materials in, like all that stuff. So I was juggling between doing final tweaks to design, scheduling, software development, organizing investment, but then also I was communicating with the outside people, all the people that were still waiting on their printers. And it's really hard to have any clarity if you're really in the middle of every single thing like that. So I think that was like the biggest problem, was finding some way to offload that. And so I think definitely for me, moving forward, it's always finding a strong co-founder, or bringing in a strong early employee, or whatever is appropriate at the time, but really kind of stepping back and assessing, do I need help on a particular thing? Am I taking on too much? So kind of along the lines with talking about vesting and other things. The other thing that really has caused me trouble in the past is making sure that everybody understands things in black and white, or white and red in this case. So I think there's been a lot of, and this goes back to communication as well. I think almost everybody has some sort of instance where a year down the road, 2 years down the road, it's a he said, she said type of situation where somebody says, well, we agreed to this. And somebody else says, no, that's not what we agreed to. I remember it this way, right? So even if it's not like a really elaborate contract or whatever it is, just having something that clearly states what you both feel is the appropriate way of stating it goes a long way. Because especially verbal conversations after a year, it's either easy to forget. It's easy to focus on the things that you thought were important and then this other person focuses on the thing that wasn't important to you, but it becomes important later. So that's definitely, I had quite a few times in the past where we would come to a verbal agreement, and everything's hunky-dory because it's the beginning of something, and then later on it's like, well, wait a second, that's not actually what we agreed to. Or, well, specifically, there's one very specific thing where one of my investors said that I promised to do one thing, which was to not use money that they transferred to the company. And it was like, why would I agree? Why would I even accept the money at the beginning if we're not supposed to touch it, right? And it's this continual cycle of, well, let me remind you of that conversation. And I'm like, I really don't remember this. So put it in writing. And otherwise, children cry. So focus. And I think that's a lot of people when they're first starting up, anytime that you're resource-strapped, bootstrapping, so you have to take on 10 different roles. But at some point, once you start growing the company, in order to be able to scale, in order for it to be a scalable enterprise, you have to find some way to distribute that load. You have to figure out where is my expertise, where's the end of my expertise. So, like, for instance, so startup accounting, right? On one hand, yes, you don't need a full accounting, at the beginning, but on the other hand, well, especially with Makeable, our cash flow, because we're taking orders and then delivering them, there's a pretty high turnover in terms of number of transactions, and we had to keep track of whose order had been actually delivered, whose order was outstanding, all these things. And if you don't do it when you start building up these transactions, going back and digging through what's the appropriate way of booking it in and who was delivered and whatever, it's a lot of work. And you don't realize it until a year later, and you're trying to dig out of that. So I think, for me, bringing somebody on board that was an advisor that had more of a financial background would have actually probably helped the business to not be where it's at this point, because it would have made me, in more black and white terms, focus on how to deliver. But the other part that I would say one of the really pear-shaped moments was, so we crowdfunded the Mickey Box, and then, like I said, I was the public-facing person, and of course there's ideas that come out of the crowd. You're facing 1,000 people, 2,000 people, whatever it is, right? It's really hard not to listen to those guys and go like, that would be really awesome. And you're sitting there with, in your mind, there's enough cash to be able to do that. And you're saying, it'll take a month to do this new thing, and it will be so awesome when we deliver it that we should just go ahead. And then if it's 6 months later and you haven't done that, and you burnt through those resources while doing that, then you've really done yourself a disservice, and you've done your customers a disservice. And that's one of the main things that I definitely did, was I got sidetracked on something that, if I'd really looked at it, it was a nice to have thing that would have been a really cool thing to talk about. But at the same time, at the core of the product, it didn't really, we would have been better off focusing on getting a simple printer out the door as soon as possible, and then building up sales and going from there. Because there's a lot of debt that gets built up over that time. So I think that's the big things that that really happened for me. As a personal aside, in Makeable, one of my co-founders is actually my wife. And it's, so just as a counter, it's been interesting. because you would think that we would have, it would have been a disaster, right? But if anything, we still, on a very regular basis, we have the conversation of, honey, do you really want to, keep on working together? Is this the right thing we should be doing? And what we found was, even though it's a hard time, even though we're going through a lot of really terrible shit, publicly, privately, all this stuff, you know what, at the end of the day, we're really happy to still do it together. And so, it's, I guess that's the thing is, why am I doing all this? It's not necessarily about a job or whatever, it's finding something that I love to do. And I think the people that have been supportive within this and definitely are in the long term useful are the people backing that journey, and not necessarily backing your company or whatever it is. Because the people that are going to be, when things go pear-shaped, that are going to be supportive are the ones that are really looking at the big picture. So yes, you might screw up this one, but then, so what's next? And so that's one thing that I learned was start looking at people more that are backing your journey rather than backing the company itself. Because the company may fail, but if you have people behind you, you can keep going. So, yeah.
Time for 2 quick questions.
Thank you, Jon, for sharing. I think not only you, but also Martin, both of you guys have mentioned a lot of things about people, about getting the right guy on board, especially at the early stage of the startup. That makes me wonder, actually, first of all, how would you identify and locate the right guy as a co-founder or especially, or maybe an early employer? Because I understand the difference of that guy can make a lot of difference to the future path of that company. And secondly, how would you persuade that person to get on board with you?
The first question I want to pick up in 10 or 100 minutes.
Yeah, well, yeah, so I think a lot of it is serendipity, to be honest. And convincing people, it's really, you have to come together, right? So you have to develop that trust, and you have to evaluate if you're going to get along. And where do you find the people? It really, it's just like, how do you find anybody within the world, right? You just, sometimes, yes, you can look around and find somebody that's qualified, but then the people that are always the most amazing are the ones that just come through some random connection, I think. At least that's what I found. There's not really A, B, C to connect to there. But then qualifying it, I think you have to be, it's like my grandmother said about marriage. You have to go in with the eyes open, at the beginning, and then, eyes half closed, after you're committed. So it's, you really have to be very upfront about it, I think, and really, is it a good fit?
Any more questions?
I think both the two initial speakers have had quite a lot to say about hardware startups, and you've made different decisions. They chose to outsource their manufacturing in Shenzhen. You chose to set up and do your own manufacturing in-house. Given the plethora of manufacturers that are so close by, why do you choose to make that decision?
Okay, so this is very specific to what we were manufacturing. It is intended to be a kit that was produced maybe 1,000 units, 2,000 units at most. At the end of the day, we ended up having about 3,000 orders for it. So we really, if we had known that it would be as successful as it was in advance, we probably would have, from the beginning, designed it to be mass produced in a factory over the border. So it's kind of partially that, partially coming into it, the intention was to set up a manufacturing base that can handle 100 units, 500 units, 1,000 units or something, which is not really a good fit for larger factories in China or any place really. And so that was kind of the sweet spot. The idea was we'd set up the manufacturing and then use it for other things, but ended up that we just really got focused on that one product, but then it was kind of a mismatch in terms of that resource at the end of the day. So yeah, hindsight's great. All right?
Okay, you lost